The moment Stephen Miller opened his mouth, he thought he owned the room. His smirk carried the weight of years spent basking in the echo chamber of his own arrogance, and his voice cut through the chamber like nails against glass. He leaned forward, elbows planted, posture dripping with the confidence of a man who had never been told no by the circles that empowered him. For a fleeting instant, it seemed as though the stage belonged entirely to him. But silence has a way of sharpening the air before history is made. In that breathless pause, all eyes shifted, not toward Miller's smug theatrics, but toward the calm figure across from him. Jasmine Crockett sat poised, unshaken, her gaze steady, her expression unreadable. She didn't fidget, didn't flinch, didn't even blink. She simply waited as though she knew exactly how this scene would play out. The room itself seemed to tighten. Cameras zoomed in, pens froze mid-scribble, and the faint shuffle of papers came to an abrupt halt. The arrogance on Miller's face suggested he believed the moment was already his victory. What he didn't realize was that his words were merely the spark, and Crockett was the storm gathering in silence. When she finally spoke, her first words sliced through his performance like glass shattering on stone. Her voice was calm, almost gentle, but behind it lived the weight of conviction. Each syllable carried the sting of truth sharpened by experience, and the smug grin on Miller's face faltered, just slightly, but enough for the cameras to catch it. It was in that instant the energy shifted. What Miller thought would be a lecture turned into an ambush of his own making. Crockett wasn't here to play his game, she was here to end it, and the audience, both in the chamber and far beyond, could feel the tide turning. Whispers rippled across the room. Some exchanged glances of disbelief. Others stifled grins as if they knew they were witnessing a political moment destined to be replayed again and again. Miller had believed his words would dominate the headlines. Instead, Crockett's composure was about to rewrite the story in real time. And what she delivered next would not only silence Stephen Miller, it would leave even his closest allies without a single defense. Stephen Miller did not stumble into this moment by accident. For years, his reputation had been carefully constructed on a foundation of provocation, cruelty masked as policy, and the smug belief that intimidation could pass for intellect. He thrived on confrontation, not because he sought truth, but because he believed conflict was the surest way to dominate. To him, every room was an arena, every opponent a target. He had perfected the art of turning sneers into strategy and bullying into a brand. But across from him sat someone forged in an entirely different fire. Jasmine Crockett's rise was not built on provocation but on principle. She hadn't clawed her way to the national stage through theatrics or shock value. She came armed with something far more enduring, a deep-rooted commitment to justice, sharpened by years of fighting for those whose voices had been ignored. Where Miller's story was one of entitlement weaponized, Crockett's was one of resilience rewarded. That contrast was not subtle, it was electric. It charged the air in the chamber, visible to anyone paying attention. On one side, a man who relished power for power's sake, leaning into his reputation as a provocateur. On the other, a woman who saw power as a responsibility, wielding it not to intimidate but to illuminate. This was not just another debate. It was a collision of two very different Americas, playing out under the brightest of lights. The stakes of their clash stretched far beyond that room. For Miller, it was a chance to reassert himself, to remind his base of the combative arrogance they celebrated. For Crockett, it was an opportunity to embody something greater, to show that dignity and truth could hold the line against even the loudest antagonists. And for the country, it became a test of values. Would arrogance prevail once more, or would clarity and courage finally take the upper hand? As Miller postured, gesturing with the smug bravado of someone who assumed history was on his side, Crockett sat unflinching. Her silence wasn't passive, it was strategy. She knew the weight of this encounter. She understood that sometimes the most powerful weapon in the room wasn't the loudest voice but the sharpest truth, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. The audience watching, both live and through the unblinking lens of cameras, could feel it building. Social media buzzed in real time. Tweets fired off as people sensed something historic brewing. Commentators whispered to each other in the gallery, caught between fascination and disbelief. This wasn't just another skirmish in Washington's endless cycle of bickering. It was shaping up to be a defining clash, one that would ripple far beyond the walls of the chamber. Miller's arrogance, as ever, blinded him. He mistook the silence for submission, failing to recognize the storm brewing in Crockett's poise. Every word he uttered, every jab he thought would rattle her, only set the stage for his undoing. He was building the scaffold of his own downfall, brick by smug brick, unaware that Crockett's patience was the wrecking ball poised to swing. And so, as the room leaned in and the country watched, the stakes sharpened into a single, unmistakable truth. This was more than a debate. It was a battle for the soul of the moment, a fight to decide whether arrogance or principle would command the floor. What no one yet realized was that Miller's words, the very ones he thought gave him control, were laying the foundation for one of the most viral mic drop moments of the year. To understand why Stephen Miller walked into that chamber so sure of himself, you have to know the history that shaped him. His entire career has been built on a single posture, the sneer of a man convinced that cruelty is strength. For Miller, politics was never about service, it was about domination. He believed words could be wielded as weapons, and the more they cut, the more effective they were. From his earliest days in Washington, Miller cultivated a reputation as the architect of some of the most hardline, divisive policies in recent memory. He was the shadow whisper behind measures that split families apart at the border, the unapologetic face of an ideology that sought to pit us against them. His rhetoric was steeped in coded language, statements that, on the surface, sounded like tough talk on security, but underneath, dripped with the acid of exclusion. He framed himself as a patriot defending the nation, but the subtext was always clear. His vision of America was narrow, rigid, and cruel. The arrogance wasn't just in the policies he pushed, it was in the way he carried himself, in hearings and interviews. And even in private meetings, Miller projected condescension like it was armor. He dismissed opponents as naive, laughed at critics as though their concerns were beneath him, and spoke with the certitude of a man convinced he was the smartest in any room. To him, politics was theater, and he always imagined himself the director. Yet beneath that performance, contradictions simmered. He spoke endlessly about American values, yet his vision excluded vast swaths of Americans who didn't fit his mold. He railed against so-called elitism, even as he clung to power through elite institutions and connections. He demanded accountability from others while dodging it himself. His career was a study in hypocrisy. The man who preached toughness but bristled at the slightest challenge. The man who claimed to honor law while bending it to serve his own ideology. For many watching, Miller represented more than just a political figure. He was the embodiment of a worldview that sought to diminish, divide, and demean. He wore arrogance like a badge, but that arrogance made him predictable. He thrived on provoking outrage, but he underestimated the quiet power of patience, and that would prove to be his undoing. Consider the countless times his policies backfired, sparking outrage not only from progressives, but from communities across the nation who felt betrayed by his vision. Each time, he doubled down, sneering through criticism, insisting that outrage meant he was winning. He never realized that what he called victories were actually seeds of resistance, galvanizing those who would one day stand across from him. That's why his posture in the chamber carried such weight. It wasn't just Stephen Miller speaking. It was the living echo of years of cruelty dressed up as policy. When he leaned forward, smug and certain, it wasn't only Crockett he sought to belittle. It was every immigrant family he'd dismissed, every marginalized voice he'd tried to silence, every critic he'd waved off as irrelevant. And yet, his greatest weakness was hidden in plain sight. Miller mistook volume for power, cruelty for strategy, and provocation for permanence. He never understood that arrogance is brittle, that once it cracks, it crumbles. He believed his past victories made him untouchable, blind to the reality that his record was the very thing that made his downfall inevitable. By the time he squared off with Jasmine Crockett, Miller carried the weight of his own contradictions into the room. His smugness was no longer just arrogance. It was baggage, visible to every person who had followed his career. His dismissiveness no longer read as clever, it read as tired. His condescension, once effective in silencing critics, now rang hollow against a generation of leaders unwilling to bow. The audience watching didn't just see Stephen Miller. They saw years of frustration, years of policies that had torn at the fabric of the nation, years of smirks that dismissed the pain of others. And in Jasmine Crockett, they saw the possibility of an answer. The tension wasn't simply about two people in a room, it was about the clash of legacies. Miller entered that chamber convinced of his dominance. But what he didn't realize was that every ounce of his arrogance, every policy, every smirk, had prepared the audience not to fear him, but to crave his takedown. And Jasmine Crockett was about to give them exactly that. Before Jasmine Crockett ever stepped into that chamber, before the cameras rolled and Stephen Miller's arrogance tried to command the air, her story had already been written in fire. She was not born into privilege or groomed for politics by the machinery of Washington. She was born into a world that required resilience, and she carried that resilience like armor, forged through years of struggle, sacrifice, and service. Her earliest lessons were not in ivory towers, but in the reality of what it meant to work twice as hard just to be taken half as seriously. She saw it in her community, where opportunity was scarce but hope was abundant. She absorbed it in the quiet strength of her family, who taught her that dignity was not something anyone could grant or take away. It was carried within. From those roots, Crockett grew into a fighter, not by choice but by necessity. The path she chose was not the easy one. She pursued law, not because it promised wealth or prestige, but because it gave her a weapon sharper than any insult, stronger than any wall of arrogance. The ability to stand in courtrooms and speak for those the system had tried to forget. Every late night poring over cases, every morning spent in cramped offices with clients who had been overlooked, sharpened her instincts. She learned how to dismantle arguments with precision, how to strip away bluster until only the truth remained. As a defense attorney, she represented the marginalized, the voiceless, the ones society was quickest to dismiss. She walked into courtrooms where the odds were stacked against her and left with victories that were more than legal, they were human. Each case hardened her resolve, each client's story etched deeper into her understanding of justice. It wasn't theory for her. It was lived reality, and that reality gave her something Stephen Miller could never buy or perform: authenticity. Her transition into public service was not a leap into ambition but a continuation of that fight on a larger stage. She carried with her the courtroom cadence, the calm under pressure, the instinct to listen before striking. But more than that, she carried her community, their voices, their struggles, their hopes. Every time she spoke, it wasn't just Jasmine Crockett speaking. It was an echo of those she had defended, amplified through her. What set her apart was not just her skill but her composure. While others met arrogance with volume, Crockett mastered the art of stillness. She understood that silence could be more powerful than shouting, that dignity under fire could unravel even the most aggressive opponent. She had faced prosecutors who sneered, judges who doubted, and systems designed to break her clients. She had never flinched. That unshakable calm was her weapon, and she wielded it with surgical precision. For progressives, for immigrants, for anyone who had felt unseen or unheard, Crockett embodied validation. She was proof that someone could rise from struggle and not only survive but thrive without losing their voice or their values. She carried pride in her identity, not as a shield but as a banner. Her very presence in that chamber was an act of defiance against those who had built their careers on exclusion. The admiration she inspired was not blind loyalty. It was recognition. Recognition that here was someone who had lived the very battles she now fought publicly. recognition that her victories were not hers alone, but belonged to everyone who saw themselves reflected in her. That's why her showdown with Stephen Miller resonated so deeply. He represented a legacy of arrogance that dismissed entire communities. She represented a legacy of resilience that refused to be erased. When they faced each other, it wasn't just two individuals clashing, it was two visions of America. And Crockett's vision was not abstract. It was grounded in her journey, in every courtroom where she refused to back down, in every community meeting where she listened when others ignored, in every speech where she chose conviction over convenience. That journey gave her a clarity Miller could never match. His power was borrowed from institutions that protected him. Hers was earned, line by line, case by case, victory by victory. So when the cameras turned and the nation leaned in, Jasmine Crockett was not rattled by Stephen Miller's arrogance. She had seen worse. She had defeated worse. His condescension was nothing compared to the systemic walls she had already broken through. His smirk was nothing compared to the doubt she had already dismantled. And it was precisely this life experience that prepared her for the moment Stephen Miller tried to corner her. It began the way it always does with Stephen Miller, loud, dismissive, drenched in the certainty that no one would dare challenge him. He didn't wait for his turn. He cut in, clipped sentences spilling out with the rhythm of someone who believed interruption itself was dominance. His tone carried that signature sneer, the kind that reduced complex truths into cheap sound bites, each designed to provoke, each intended to diminish. "Congresswoman, with all due respect," he began, though there was no respect in his voice, only the condescension of a man convinced he was the sharpest in the room. His words weren't arguments so much as accusations wrapped in smug rhetoric. He spoke over her, around her, at her, never to her. And with every sentence his grin widened, his confidence thickened, as if the performance itself was proof of victory. The chamber shifted uneasily. Some heads bowed, scribbling notes to avoid the spectacle. Others leaned back, watching with folded arms, their expressions betraying the same discomfort felt by anyone who has witnessed arrogance on full display. Miller mistook their silence for support, as though the absence of interruption was applause. But Jasmine Crockett didn't flinch. She didn't raise her voice or flash irritation. She sat, shoulders straight, expression calm, eyes fixed on him like a surgeon preparing for the first incision. Her stillness unsettled more than any outburst could have. While Miller puffed himself up with every passing word, Crockett's silence became heavier, more deliberate, drawing the room's attention away from him and toward her. The subtlety of her strategy was easy to miss for anyone caught up in Miller's theatrics. He mistook her composure for weakness, his interruptions for victory. Yet those watching closely could see the shift, the faintest arch of an eyebrow, the tightening of her lips, the way she tilted her head ever so slightly as if cataloging every jab. She was building something, not with volume but with patience. Miller continued, throwing out dismissive remarks as if each one were a final blow. "You don't understand the realities," he sneered. "You're emotional, not logical. This is why serious policy is left to serious people." Each insult stacked upon the last. A tower of arrogance that only he believed could not be toppled. The grin on his face grew, the smugness settling into his posture. He leaned back in his chair with the air of a man certain he had already won the room. For him, the debate was over. For everyone else, the debate hadn't even begun. Around the chamber, glances darted toward Crockett. Some expected her to erupt, to match his interruptions with fire. Others braced for the clash. But Crockett remained still, the kind of stillness that carries its own gravity, pulling the air tighter, sharper, more electric. She wasn't playing his game. She was waiting, letting him build his tower of arrogance higher and higher, knowing full well that towers built on condescension collapse under the weight of their own weakness. The tension in the room reached its peak. Every word from Miller grew louder but less convincing. Every smirk felt more desperate, more forced. And then, silence. He had run out of breath, perhaps convinced that the lack of immediate rebuttal was proof of his triumph. He leaned back once more, satisfied. But the silence he mistook for surrender was something else entirely. It was strategy. It was composure. It was the gathering of a storm. And then, with a calmness that cut sharper than any insult, Jasmine Crockett leaned in. The silence after Miller's tirade stretched like a taut wire, vibrating with tension. For a heartbeat, it seemed as though the chamber itself held its breath, waiting to see whether Jasmine Crockett would retreat or retaliate. She did neither. Instead, she leaned forward, elbows resting lightly, eyes locking on Miller with the precision of a marksman. Her voice when it came was measured, low, deliberate, not the roar he expected, but something sharper, more dangerous. "Mr. Miller," she began, pausing just long enough to make the use of his name sting. "You've spent your career mistaking cruelty for policy. You've mistaken arrogance for strength, and you've mistaken the silence of others for agreement. But let me be clear, none of those mistakes work here." The words dropped into the room like stones into still water, rippling outward. Miller's grin faltered just for a moment. His eyes darted as if searching for the cue card that wasn't there. The chamber stirred, papers shuffled, a cough echoed, and then stillness again, as though everyone understood they were on the edge of something unforgettable. Crockett let the silence breathe, then continued, her cadence building like a slow crescendo. "You say people like me are too emotional, but I've sat with mothers who had to bury their children because of policies you supported. I've stood with families torn apart by decisions you championed. If you call that emotion, then yes, I will wear it with pride. Because what you dismiss as weakness is in fact humanity, and that is something you will never own because you've spent your life running from it." A murmur swept across the room. Someone shifted uncomfortably. Miller shifted too, his shoulders hunched, his hands fidgeting with a pen that seemed suddenly too small, too fragile in his grasp. Crockett pressed on, her voice unwavering. "You lecture me about logic, about being serious, as if intelligence is measured by how loudly you can sneer. But let me tell you what serious looks like. Serious is staying up all night preparing to defend someone the system forgot. Serious is showing up for your community when there are no cameras, no headlines, no smirks to hide behind. Serious is service, not spectacle." The chamber buzzed again. The contrast was stark, undeniable. Miller, slouched and blinking rapidly, versus Crockett, steady and luminous. She paused, and the pause itself was devastating. Then, softly but firmly, she said, "You think you own this room, but you don't even own your own contradictions." Miller's head jerked slightly, his mouth opening as if to interject, but Crockett cut him off, not with volume but with timing. "You claim to honor American values, yet your policies betray them. You speak of family, then design rules to tear them apart. You speak of freedom, then push measures that cage children. You speak of patriotism, but your vision of America excludes the very people who built it, bled for it, and continue to believe in it despite people like you." Gasps, actual gasps. The sound filled the chamber, small but unmistakable, like a collective exhale no one had realized they were holding. Miller froze, his smirk gone, replaced by the tightness of a man cornered by his own record. And Crockett was not done. "You want to talk about strength? Strength is not sneering from behind a desk. Strength is not mocking the vulnerable while hiding behind power. Strength is walking into a hostile room, knowing the deck is stacked and speaking truth anyway. Strength is dignity under fire. And strength, real strength, is something you will never recognize because you have confused fear with respect for far too long." The rhythm of her words struck like hammer blows. With each sentence, Miller shrank. He broke eye contact, glanced down, shifted in his seat. His pen rolled off the desk and clattered to the floor, and the sound seemed to underline his unraveling. Crockett didn't flinch. "You've made a career out of underestimating people like me. People who don't fit into your narrow vision of who deserves a voice. But every time you underestimate us, you make the same mistake. You give us the chance to show the world that your arrogance is hollow, that your cruelty is cowardice, and that your version of America is nothing more than a mask slipping further every day." Silence again. Heavy, unblinking silence. Even Miller's allies avoided his gaze. Then came the moment. The one destined for replay. The one destined for memes, for hashtags, for history. Crockett leaned back slightly, her eyes never leaving his. Her final words landed with the weight of a gavel. You thought you owned this room. But Stephen, this room never belonged to you. It belongs to the people. And the people are done being silenced. The chamber erupted, not in chaos, but in a kind of stunned, electrified energy. Suppressed laughter from those who couldn't contain it. Gasps from those who hadn't expected such precision. And the quiet awe of those who recognized they had just witnessed the exact second the power in the room shifted. Miller sat frozen, a man unaccustomed to losing control, suddenly exposed under the harshest of lights. His hands trembled slightly as he reached for his notes, but the words he sought had already been dismantled, brick, by a voice steadier, sharper, stronger than his arrogance could withstand. And as cameras captured every flicker of his unraveling, the world outside began to take notice. Clips were already being clipped, tweets already being typed. Within minutes, the story would no longer be his sneer, it would be her mic drop. Because in that moment, Jasmine Crockett had not just silenced Stephen Miller. She had reminded everyone watching of a truth larger than politics itself. Dignity will always outlast arrogance. And the shockwaves of that reminder were only just beginning. The chamber's silence had barely settled before the world outside began to roar. Screens lit up, notifications pinged, and the clip of Jasmine Crockett's dismantling of Stephen Miller traveled with the velocity of wildfire. Within minutes, hashtags bloomed like neon across the digital landscape. Crockett mic drop, Miller humbled, dignity wins. Twitter, or what some stubbornly still called X, turned into a stage of collective catharsis. The first viral post came from a teenager in Houston, a clipped 15-second video of Miller fumbling his pen as Crockett delivered the line, "This room never belonged to you." The caption was simple, devastating. "Pack it up, Stephen." In less than an hour, it had over 2 million views. TikTok users layered the footage over everything from gospel choirs to rap beats, syncing her delivery to crescendos that made the takedown feel like a cinematic climax. Instagram Reels paired it with slow-motion replays, zooming in on Miller's unraveling expressions, turning humiliation into art. Cable networks scrambled to keep pace. Commentators who had long tolerated Miller's sneering brand of politics suddenly spoke with unrestrained clarity. On MSNBC, a panelist declared, "This wasn't just a debate moment. This was a cultural exorcism. Stephen Miller's smugness finally met its reckoning." Even outlets that typically shielded him couldn't avoid acknowledging the spectacle. One conservative columnist wrote begrudgingly, "Say what you will about her politics, Crockett owned that exchange. Miller had no answers." And the praise rolled in. Civil rights leaders invoked her courage as a model of principled defiance. Celebrities amplified her words. Ava DuVernay retweeted the clip with, "This is cinema, real-life justice unscripted." John Legend posted, "Strength is dignity under fire." Crockett said it, lived it, and showed it. Even late-night comedians couldn't resist, their monologues looping Miller's paling face alongside punchlines that practically wrote themselves. But beyond the laughter and memes, something deeper stirred. Young organizers across the country latched onto Crockett's performance as proof that arrogance could be dismantled with poise, that bullies crumble when faced with unshakable truth. On college campuses, students replayed the moment as a study in composure under fire. One viral TikTok featured a classroom watching the exchange, students leaping to their feet, cheering as if it were a championship game. For many, it wasn't just entertainment, it was vindication. Immigrant families, progressive activists, and everyday citizens who had long endured Miller's rhetoric saw in Crockett a voice that carried theirs. She said what we've been wanting to say for years. One mother from Los Angeles posted, her video garnering hundreds of thousands of likes. Finally, someone didn't just survive his arrogance, they turned it inside out. Even her opponents, privately if not publicly, acknowledged the shift. Whispers moved through political circles. Miller had lost more than a debate. He had lost the illusion of invulnerability. Allies who once admired his ability to dominate rooms now questioned whether his time as a feared provocateur had ended in a single televised instant. And Crockett, she became not just a congresswoman but a symbol. For weeks afterward, invitations to speak surged. Editorials hailed her as the embodiment of a new generation of leadership, sharp, unflinching, rooted in values larger than ego. "This is how you fight back," read one viral op-ed. "Not with shouting, but with truth that cuts deeper than any insult." The cultural resonance was unmistakable. Memes turned Miller's crumbling into a shorthand for arrogance undone. Reaction gifs spread. His smirk fatting, his eyes darting, his shoulders sagging, and always paired with her steady gaze, her words immortalized in text overlays. "Strength is dignity under fire." It felt less like a moment and more like a movement. To be part of it, whether retweeting, reposting, or simply replaying, was to participate in a collective triumph. The audience, progressive and hungry for validation, saw themselves not as bystanders but as contributors. Every share was an act of solidarity, every like a cheer echoing through the digital amphitheater. By week's end, what had begun as a clash in a committee chamber became a cultural milestone. Commentators crowned it the moment Miller was humbled, a phrase that stuck like glue across platforms. But those who felt the deeper resonance knew it was more than Miller's humiliation. It was a reminder that truth, wielded with courage, could puncture even the thickest armor of arrogance. And as the dust settled, one question lingered, humming in the background like an unresolved chord. If one voice could shift the narrative so completely, what might happen the next time Crockett steps into the ring? When the laughter, the memes, and the hashtags began to settle, what remained was not just the memory of Stephen Miller's humiliation, but the deeper imprint of what Jasmine Crockett had shown the nation. In that chamber, under the white-hot glare of cameras and the suffocating air of arrogance, she had chosen composure over chaos, principle over provocation. And in doing so, she offered a truth bigger than the spectacle itself. Dignity is power, arrogance is weakness. Her words were not just a rebuttal to Miller, they were a quiet manifesto. They reminded America that strength is not found in volume, not in bluster, not in the sneer of a man convinced he owns the room. Strength lives in the stillness of someone who refuses to bow, who refuses to break, who answers contempt with clarity. Crockett didn't just win an exchange. She carved a reminder into the collective conscience that arrogance always collapses when faced with steady truth. That is why the moment rippled far beyond politics. For immigrants who had been demonized, for young activists told their voices didn't matter, for women dismissed in rooms where men presumed authority, her composure was proof that standing firm could shift the ground beneath even the most powerful feet. It wasn't just about dismantling Stephen Miller. It was about dismantling the idea that cruelty and smugness are untouchable. There was something timeless in it, something that reached back to every moment in history when truth-tellers refused to bend before bullies. Crockett's calm was not passivity, it was defiance in its purest form, and that defiance was contagious. People watching saw a piece of themselves in her. The quiet worker ignored in a meeting, the student dismissed for their accent, the family talked over in policy debates. In her. They saw the vindication they had long craved. And that is why it mattered. Because while Stephen Miller left that chamber diminished, Crockett left it amplified, not just as an individual but as a symbol. Her takedown was not the end of a skirmish, but the beginning of a story. One where dignity does not just survive under fire but thrives, where arrogance is no longer mistaken for authority, where calm conviction speaks louder than any insult ever could. The lesson lingered long after the clip stopped trending. In homes, in classrooms, in marches, Crockett's moment became a parable. You don't have to shout to be heard, and you don't have to play their game to win. The strength of truth, delivered with composure, has a power that no amount of sneering can undo. And perhaps that was the most important message of all, that in an age of noise, when provocateurs like Miller thrive on chaos, the real revolution is calm. The real rebellion is dignity. The real victory is refusing to let arrogance set the rules of engagement. As the chamber's echoes faded into history, the moral crystallized. Respect endures, arrogance crumbles. And in that moment, one congresswoman reminded America of who we are at our best, not a nation cowed by loudness, but a people moved by clarity, fairness, and the simple power of truth. But if that day taught us anything, it was this: the fight is never over. The next insult, the next provocation, the next test will come. And the question, the challenge, will remain. Who will rise to meet it with the same dignity, the same composure, the same truth that Jasmine Crockett brought when she faced Stephen Miller? Because that is what the moment ultimately left us with. Not just applause, not just satisfaction, but a call. A reminder that arrogance can be humbled and dignity can win. And it's up to all of us to carry that lesson forward. Stephen Miller thought he owned the room. He thought his sneer, his smugness, his history of provocation would once again grant him the upper hand. But what unfolded proved the opposite. In a matter of seconds, Jasmine Crockett showed the nation that arrogance cannot stand against dignity, that noise will always falter when met with truth spoken calmly and firmly. This wasn't just another heated exchange on Capitol Hill. It was a defining moment, a reminder that composure is not weakness, it is power. Crockett stood in that chamber not just for herself, but for every voice that has been silenced, every person told they don't belong, every American weary of cruelty masquerading as strength. She turned a clash into a lesson, a humiliation into a history-making shift. And now the story belongs to all of us. Because when you share it, when you keep it alive, you're not just replaying a viral moment. You're carrying forward the proof that truth still wins, that dignity still matters, and that arrogance can and will be humbled. So if you believe arrogance should never triumph over principle, if you believe composure should always outlast provocation, then share this story. Subscribe, join this community, and help us keep the fight for dignity alive. Because this was more than a clapback. It was more than a headline. This was history being written in real time, and history is never finished. The next chapter will be written by all of us.